welcome our next speaker, Jane Thomas. Jane has worked at the Royal Darwin Hospital for over 21 years, and most of that time in the intensive care unit. Jane currently works as a research coordinator in the ICU. Approximately 50% of the patients that are cared for in the Royal Darwin Hospital ICU are Aboriginal, and many come from remote communities and homelands. Within the context of clinical trials and routine patient and family follow-up, Jane has been faced with and learnt from many unique and challenging experiences, both culturally and geographically in the vast top end. Jane has no special skills but really likes cooking and makes a mean lemon tart. Jane also enjoys dressing up and going for long walks in wild places. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you. Okay. It was remiss of me not to say this. I've just presented 2 hours ago, so poor me. But I forgot to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet, and I pay my respects to elders, present, past and emerging. So thank you for letting me talk twice today. It's been really exciting. Did you go to the party last night? Yeah, I didn't. I went to bed early and I didn't sleep. So anyway, happy days. We're on the home run. That didn't work. That worked. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about follow-up after ICU. Am I echoing or am I right? Okay. The plan of my discussion with you today is, I'm going to just say when we follow up, the challenges we have of follow-up, some of the trade-offs we have with our follow-up and some of the rewards. When we follow up, I was a research coordinator in ICU, and I should, subsequent to putting in my bio, I've left ICU, but I still have a fond regard for our ICU, and there's a lot of my heart in the ICU. But of course, I was very proud that being the research coordinator, we have quite a healthy clinical trial program going, so we have to often follow up our clinical trial participants, probably 28. Sorry, I'm getting feedback on me. 28, 3 months, 6 months, that kind of thing. And because we're really nice guys, we like to do a bit of follow-up on our regular patients. I've put there long-term patients, but what I suppose it's you suck it and see people on the ventilator more than 5 days, and of course those really long-term patients like our Guillain-Barré patients and others. Really interesting cases, you know, sometimes we get patients in like severe burns, 80% burns, or a nasty AAA that's about to blow. We have to just keep them safe and prepare them for transfer. So we see these patients in that very critical time, and it's all hands on, and we like to know what happened to those patients. So I do some of those too. And families of deceased patients, which is probably close to my heart, and I think it's a great thing to do. And if you can afford to do this in your unit, I would strongly recommend it. This came from when our first clinical trial was the SAFE study, and our ethics committee said, you know, that in that study you could put patients into the trial without getting consent. We got delayed or waived consent. But our ethics committee said, okay, if patients die, you have to tell their families that they were in the study and you're using their information. Pretty tough gig, I have to say. And the first family that I did call was actually the family of a 23-year-old girl who came up to, she was an asthmatic, she came up to Darwin doing a Contiki tour or something. She was out in Kakadu and had a severe asthmatic attack from which she did not survive. She was in the SAFE study. I had to call her parents in Sydney to explain she was part of our clinical trial and could we please use that information. I just about needed a bottle of whiskey before I did that. That's a really tough gig. It's a really tough gig. I've never done that before. And but, you know, the response I got from that girl's mum was overwhelming and really humbling for me. And it's not so scary. People like having contact when their loved ones died, and her mum took the view, if my child has done something to help other people, you know, it really broke my heart. But she also enjoyed that opportunity to tell a complete stranger who saw her daughter in her last hours what her daughter was like. Okay. So that's when. The problem we have are 46% of our patients are Aboriginal patients that live in remote communities and outstations. Those patients among our patients, there are many, many languages, and it's not always easy to pick up the phone and have a chat with these people. So it has... you know, I think what the crux of what I want to say here is with the clinical trial follow-up and the selection of follow-up tools that we use. And there you've got a couple of types. One's the EQ5D, which is 5 nice, tidy questions and how's your health today. Then you look at something like SF36, which is 36 questions. I would never get that when I'm talking to people whose language is, you know, fifth language is English and I'm on the telephone. The SF56, I want to call it an oxymoron because it just, short form is not. Even for an English-speaking person, it's quite an arduous form, really. And then Dr. Walsh spoke about the validity of some of these standard follow-up tools that we're using to measure the quality of life of ICU patients. And I quite agree. I don't know that they cut it, the ones that we're using out and about now, but particularly I'm really confident that they don't match the needs of our Aboriginal patients. And when I grow up, I would like to really develop a tool that is meaningful and tells us the outcome of our Aboriginal patients. But I've got a little while to go yet. I just want to tell you an example of follow-up is one day I phoned Joyce. She lives on Tiwi Islands, and I phoned Joyce. She didn't answer the phone. Husband Johnny answered the phone, and I explained who I am and just checking up on Joyce, see how she's going, and remember she was in that research study. And Johnny remembered because he gave consent for the study. And anyway, no, she's out and about. And I basically got the EQ5D from Johnny. But then when he worked out I wasn't from the government, and after, wrong information, he said, "Do you want to speak to Joyce?" And oh, if she's there, that would be lovely. Then you've got the real deal, haven't you? You've got it from the patient, not the proxy. Anyway, Joyce comes on the phone, and I think I did 2 questions, and Joyce goes, "Have you finished now?" "I'm playing cards." And that's great, Joyce, I'm finished now. And, tick 10 out of 10, quality of life was right for Joyce because she was at home on community doing what she liked to do. She was with her friends and family, and that's what's really important for our Aboriginal people. Their most important part of health is being back on their land in their community. It's not necessarily that they're not crook anymore. The tyranny of distance, like Joyce, many of our patients come from remote communities, so actually catching up with them is not easy. And we often get patients from over the border. We have flurries of getting people from Northwest Australia. So it's not always easy. It's not like phoning up someone in Parap. It does itself present challenges. there's a mobile population with our Aboriginal people. There's a lot of movement between communities, that people don't just go home and stay there. They'll move across, they'll go home to community A but go to community B to attend a ceremony and functions that are important to them. Often while they've gone over there, the wet season has come and they have to stay there for the 6 months till the waters go down. They haven't got small planes to get around in. Now, a lot of our patients, our Aboriginal patients, are actually long grassers. This is becoming a really not very politically correct term, but I don't like itinerants either. But basically, long grassers are people who live in around town, in the parks and on the beaches. They haven't got a home. They're impoverished, poor people, but they're happy in the long grass. We have a lot of travellers and tourists coming to the wonderful top end. Grey nomads like myself hooking up the camper trailer and, getting sick at the first stop. We also have cruisers, cruise ships. Do a risk assessment before you go on a cruise. We have had we get quite a bit of activity throughout the year from cruise ships. And often these people are either overseas or come from interstate. And we also have this group of people that I call Balinese Australians. We haven't had one for lately, to my knowledge, but a lot of Australians decide to go and live in Bali. I don't know what it is, lifestyle or something, but I think people they're over there, they get barley belly back to back, and eventually they get a catastrophic abdomen and they have to come back to Darwin. The first port of call they come to is Darwin, because they get from Bali, care flight will bring them to Darwin ICU. So catching up with those people, if they go back to Bali or go back to family in Australia, it's different. So this is just to show you the wet season. This is the local lagoon, where it means lagoon. It's a beautiful part of the world, and I've got a regular family of Jabberoos I say hello to. But this is probably February. It's rained out. I won't get round there again until the 12th of July. I know that because that's my puppy's birthday. But that just shows you, what a difference the wet season can make. I don't know if you can see that sign, but that says Scotty's Walkway, and that water is probably up to my waist. And this is a long grass kitchen. How would you like that for the view from your kitchen window? The beautiful Arafura Sea. And this is the Mindle Beach, at the Mindle Beach. If you've been to Darwin, you might have gone to the Mindle Beach markets, but that's a typical long grass camp. That was a couple of Sundays ago. Better than my view from my kitchen window. But they don't actually, when they camp on Mindle, they don't actually camp right on the beach there. That's where they'll do their cooking and socialising. They'll be back on the grass because there's some big crocs in that water. Just last week there was a 2.5 metre floating around in that bay. Connectivity. Mobile phones. When our patients are in ICU, they're on the blower permanently. If they've got a phone, they're on the phone. They're talking to their friends and family. Whereas my friends don't phone me because it's too darn expensive. I get texts. I'm not on Facebook, so I miss out on life really. But often when people leave ICU, we gather the information. How can we contact you when you go? And I can have 5 phone numbers for one person, and by the time it comes to the 6-month follow-up, not one of them are working. It's disconnected. It doesn't exist. And probably on a more serious note is they're a hot commodity. People, our ladies will often wear those brightly coloured rayon skirts, and they'll wear them in layers. They don't just wear one, but they'll have their basics card in one pocket and then the phone in the other, and often the phones are taken by people who think it's their property, not their property. That's another story in itself. But yeah, it's difficult to get hold of them. And there I've got service. What service? I live 45 kilometres from the centre of Darwin, and I have to stand out by the swimming pool and on one leg and put my tongue in a funny spot to get service. I cannot take a call in the house. But I think if there's a satellite up there somewhere, there must be a mountain of mobile phones from Darwin, because they just go missing. I have very little, there's a definite attrition rate with the mobile phones. Unusual contacts. Sometimes I get a landline number and I think, bonus. I've got a direct line here to the person I'm after. But an example where it's not that straightforward is one day I phoned up looking for a lady that was in our ICU. She was a young lady, following her up after study participation, and the person who answered the phone was actually the patient had nominated this lady as her next of kin, but she was actually the soup kitchen lady. Over time, we have different organisations that have a bit of government funding, then it stops and then it starts again. They have a slightly different name, but the lady I spoke to was one of these ladies. They go around town looking after the long grasses, checking in on them, making sure they've got a bit of tucker and keeping safe. When I realised who I was talking to, and I said, "Oh, she gave it," and she said, "Yeah, that's because she has no family." And we talked about why the patient who I was chasing sort of probably led a very hazardous lifestyle with maybe too much liquor and too much playing up in very unsafe circumstances sometimes. And the soup kitchen lady explained to me she's already lost 3 sisters. And, there is no hope. So they just keep going back and living that lifestyle. You've got nothing to look forward to, so enjoy it while you can. Stick with what you're doing. They know they're not going to live very long. I think that was really, really sad. And then telephone box. Telephone boxes do still exist. It cracks me up when sometimes you get the call. I'm assuming off the bat that it's a house contact number, but invariably someone between the age of 4 and 7 will pick up the phone. Yeah, and you say, "Oh, can I speak to Johnny?" And they go, and then the kid will go, "Johnny, Ballender on the phone," and this echoes around the community. And if you hang on long enough, Johnny will actually come to the phone box. So they definitely still have their uses, the good old phone boxes. Some of the trade-offs that I've encountered, I do have this thing on my head that you can see it over the phone. It says sucker. I've got it tattooed on my head. One day this man, he said, we're talking, had his follow-up, and he said, "I've run out of dressings and it's a long weekend," and blah, blah, blah. And I was concerned that he'd end up in ED, whereas I could mitigate that by just dropping off some dressings on the way home from work. So I checked in with the clinical nurse manager, and that's all right. A few dressings. What's the diff? And but I didn't do a really good risk assessment, because the place I went to was like a part of Darwin I've never been to before, and it was kind of a housing commission community flats they were. And as I walked into the compound. You know, I could smell the ganja permeating out the windows and swastikas hanging out of some other windows. I was in a part of Darwin I didn't know existed, to be honest. So, like I say, I didn't do a good risk assessment, and I dropped those dressings off and I ran for my life. But spare a thought for the community nurses. They go to these places, but it's probably the same everywhere where you go into a high-risk place that a community nurse is travelling to. The things people need, sometimes you go and see people on the ward, they haven't got shampoo or whatever. Some people have nothing, no one to visit them. They don't have a bathroom bag, so I'm quite happy to drop off some shampoo or whatever. I have been asked to visit family members on the ward and take clothes. So I've learnt that the salvos, you can get a beaut bag of clothes, and if you're shopping for babies, it's almost new stuff for $25 for a big bag of clothes, and I like to just think of it as the gift that gives twice. No can do. One story is we had an alcoholic young lady, professional lady in our ICU, and she was in hospital for a long time, and when I got to follow her up, she told me she hadn't gone back to work yet, but there was the interview she could attend, but she just said, I can't stop shaking. If you could give me some Valium, I know I would get back. I know I'd get the interview, and I know I could get back on track. So it's heartbreaking, the things you are asked for. Batteries for motorised scooters, sort out housing and help with funeral expenses. Of course I can't do that. This is moi, Saturday mornings in Humpty Doo. My husband drops me off. What are you going there for again? I drive my husband nuts. The rewards of family follow-up, patient and family follow-up. We get to hear their story. We look after the patients when they're really sick. We hear their progress. So we're often sending patients out of ICU. They're not really out, they're in that murky phase, aren't they? But when they go into state, we don't get to hear about them. So through our follow-up, we do at least get that progress, so that's nice. Opportunities to ask questions, particularly for the families of deceased patients. You know, opening that door, giving them we send a sympathy card with my number and name, and they can call up if they have an inquiry. But sometimes people just want to know what bug it was that caused the pneumonia that killed their dad or whatever. Sometimes people want to go through the encounter again. They didn't hear all the information, and I have to say our intensivists have been really great with this. They will, if I ask, they have been very happy to call or even meet with family members if they want to come back in and go through what happened to their loved one again. We have had a case just recently where sometimes with Aboriginal people there's a consideration that there's a sinister something that happened to make the patient die. It wasn't the ruptured AVM, it was something else, and there's someone to blame and there's payback to be dealt with. We had a lady, she's in town because she has end-stage renal failure, and she was like a senior family member, and she was fielding calls from the community who are saying, you know, she died because of so-and-so's done this to her. So she actually had a talk with our consultant, Dr. Sid. He's from India, and he was very... he had empathy because also in his culture can be this supernatural thing, and they worked it out, and she was happy and she could rest and she could switch off the humbugging that was coming from community. Feedback from family and patients and families, they tell us things we can work on. In particular, and also compliments. People often say to me, that nurse Sarah, she just looked after me, and sometimes individual nurses make such connections with our patients, but gives me no greater pleasure than to go to Sarah or whoever and tell them that what the patient has said about them, and it just makes their day. It's really important. A bit of fun. Kathleen was one of our long-term patients in ICU, like 44 days, I think. She was also in a research study. I kept lots of contact with Kathleen. One day I was leaving work, I was going into town for something, and Kathleen lives in a community in town called the Bagot community. I've seen the community from the road, but I didn't realise what it was like inside. As we drove in, I said, I'll drop you off. As we drove in this taxi, I realised I was in another world, a really poor world where there was clear poverty and overcrowding and a really unkempt place for right in the middle of Darwin. I was blown away. But as we drove in, family members were sitting outside a house and there was all this shouting going on. Sometimes people, when there's Aboriginal people get excited or inquisitive, they can shout and you think, oh, there's something wrong. They're having an argument. And I was terrified that I was in trouble or got Kathleen in trouble because I was on their land without permit. All this stuff's going through my mind, and Kathleen got out the car and she slammed the door and she said, "It's just Jane, my doctor sister." And then, hilarity, they were happy with that. But I don't know what the boss thought about me being promoted to doctor. But the main thing about this rewards is people really, really like it. People really, really like it. They love that, especially with the deceased family members. They cannot believe that you've called them up. It's a lonely time out there after the first 2 weeks, after death. Everyone's there from wherever, and then 6 weeks later they haven't spoken to anyone for 2 weeks, and we phone up and it's just someone else is there, and they just really like it. So in conclusion, just be patient with follow-up wherever you work. Eventually you sort of get your catch. It's worth it, so just do it. And how can a girl from the Territory not put a crock on a PowerPoint? But this is our director took this photo when he was out in Kakadu one day. Should have been in doing his admin, but anyway, there's been I've been fielding phone calls about my crazy photograph and what did we have to submit the bio, and I thought, I was hoping they say this girl can't present, but karma got me and they made me present twice. But I put on there, I like dressing up. I do like dressing up. I'll never miss an opportunity, but this is at work. I dressed up for a girl who wanted to walk into ICU singing "The Eye of the Tiger" one day, and she was a special staff member, and so I'm going to go in as a tiger. But yeah, you do great work. You do really serious work, but you do have to have a bit of fun. Look after each other and enjoy.
So Jane, your bio claimed that you have no special skills, but I think we've just witnessed that you have special skills in connecting with people and making a difference in their lives. So thank you. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
Thank you, Jane.
That's good. I'm going for a Bex and a lie down now.